I'm James Gomes, and for the last 13 or 14 years, I've been rereading Siddhartha.
Okay, so when we talked about this originally, the first thing that caught my attention, forget the book, which I had already read before I talked to you, but rereading books, I think I have probably reread in my entire life maybe 5, 6 books total, and I never read a third time. I've never read a book a third time. Do you normally reread books you love, or is this really a rare exception for this one book?
I do reread it. There's so many books to read, so I mean, it's
Right.
kind of, the rereading is safe. It's very safe. You know what you're going to get on a reread. So there's a few, but when I was less of a reader, I would reread books more like watching a movie. So I've read Into the Wild probably 5 to 6 times. But most of those times when I read that book, I wasn't really a reader. I read Tuesday with Morrie probably 3 or 4 times. I read Lance Armstrong's book probably like 3 or 4 times.
Okay.
Because I used to like him. And I am actually reading War and Peace for the 3rd time.
Of all the things to read and reread, War and Peace. Well, you said before I was a reader. So was there a particular thing that triggered you where you like all of a sudden something opened up and you're like, I call myself a reader now. I like to read, in some way in which before this moment you're like, I'm not a reader. I don't consider myself a reader.
Yes, definitely. I would say in college, I was the type of college student that did 0 reading.
Okay.
And I got by just paying attention really well in class and taking notes. And then I would study a little bit, but I definitely didn't do any assigned readings. I typically wouldn't even buy the books. The teacher would say
you're not even cracking the books, not even for tests. You're like, I'm just not looking at the book. Okay.
No, well, because the teachers always lie on the first day, you need this book. And then after, the first couple courses, you realize, no, I don't need the book at all. And so I was that type of college student. So was definitely not a reader. And then I went to Europe after I graduated, backpacked around Europe for a summer. And I had this idea that Europeans are way smarter, way more cultured. So when I came back to the US, I did the logical thing. I wanted to become smarter. And so I decided I would do that by starting to read books. And so I started reading books then. At that point, the books that I had read before that would have been like Lance Armstrong's It's Not About the Bike, Into the Wild, Tuesday with Morrie, just very randomly someone would tell me about a book and I would start reading it and actually finish it. But maybe I'd read 10 books in my life.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So you come back and decide you're going to read. Was it easy, or did you have to like build up? There's all this crap online I see regularly where people are like, you're supposed to read to make yourself smarter and better, and it'll make it's for self-improvement and personal growth. And all these habits about like, you're going to have to build this habit. It's like a muscle. Your attention span's going to be low. When you decided, I'm going to read more when you came back from Europe, was it easy, or did you have to like grind for a while? Did you force yourself to read?
It was easy for me. I read books like The Alchemist and The Little Prince. And there was this forum that I was part of, something along the lines of alternative lifestyle, something. So I was getting some book recommendations from them. I had read Into the Wild, so I had this random note card that I had written a bunch of different books down that John Krakauer had mentioned. So I was dabbing it, but those books were probably a little too tough for me at the time. But so I was just random. I'd never really read fiction, so I was reading some pretty simple, easy. The Celestine Prophecy was one of the first books I read. Things like that.
Okay, so like accessible. You're not trying to get into like poetry from the 1500s or like Shakespearean plays. You're like, no, I'm not tackling that stuff. That's like written contemporary. That's more readable.
Yes, and then I probably transitioned. I eventually went back and read all the books I was supposed to read in high school.
Okay.
Saw that those were good. And then after that stage, I probably jumped into something like War and Peace. And at that point, I was in pretty good reading condition.
Okay. When did you encounter Hesse's Siddhartha?
So it would have been probably the first few months of getting back from Europe. So 2010.
Okay, so one of the first books you tumbled into after you got back, and you're like, I'm gonna be a reader.
Probably one of the first handful of books.
What about that first reading made you every year or every so often read it and reread it and reread it?
Nostalgia has to be, the main driving force. I think the book is good. It is a fun story. It's an easy read. It's quick. So all those things make it also a lot easier to reread. Whereas like a book like War and Peace, that's takes a lot. So I'm rereading that a chapter a day for a year. So I'm rereading over the whole year. So I think like Siddhartha, you can sit down and reread in one day if you're you set the time aside and you're focused. So it was almost spiritual for me. I would fast typically the first few years. Like I wouldn't eat and I would just read Siddhartha. And that was almost like a new beginning for the year. I typically do it in December or January.
So you'd make like a whole thing, like sort of like reflecting the same kind of fasting techniques that the monks and the mystics inside Siddhartha were doing. You're like, I literally would change my physical environment, change my habits, and then read this book as kind of like a reset.
Kind of, yeah. It just made sense. It was a way for me to kind of experience it while I was doing it.
Okay, so when I read Siddhartha, I had already read a lot of Buddhism stuff. And so then it was interesting because Siddhartha, obviously a name for the Buddha, but this is not the Buddha in the character. So when somebody asks you if you've ever described this book, what's like your elevator pitch? Like, what is Herman Hesse Siddhartha about?
This is one that I've adopted from something I read, but Herman Hesse's response to Buddhism is the novel Siddhartha.
Okay.
So Herman Hesse likes Buddhism. He likes Hinduism. He likes Taoism. He even likes probably Christianity in certain forms of that. But this is his response. This is his answer.
Did reading this, did you then go like, well, I need to understand all the things he's countering, all the things he's responding to, or you're like, I'm just going to stay here. I don't need to understand everything about Hinduism that Hess is thinking about, everything about Taoism he's thinking about.
Yeah, I pretty much ignored all that for years. I've been slowly revisiting some of those ideas. I've actually recently realized that I would consider the character Siddhartha. So yeah, I'll just stick with Siddhartha is the character in Herman Hesse's book.
Yep.
And if we talk about the Buddha, his name in the book is Gautama. So we'll just call him Gautama for anyone that's familiar with Buddhism. So I think it makes a lot more sense that Siddhartha is a Hindu character and kind of, I think you can almost ignore the Buddhism. Some people, there's 12 chapters and they say the four noble truths and the 8 part, but I don't think that's like, I don't know, that's stretching too much or like forcing it too much.
That's interesting. It makes me think of also, I got really into, maybe I had the same young man's experience reading Alan Watts' The Book. And he talks about Zen Buddhism in there, and he talks about Taoism. He doesn't talk some about Hinduism, but you realize when you get later and you get into Buddhism, you're like, oh, Alan Watts stuff, more earthy, more humorous, more down in the dust with the people, and like Hinduism, just these cycles going on, and there's not necessarily a lot you can do, whereas Buddhism is much more about controlling yourself. Hinduism, I don't know, it just feels more playful. And I thought Alan Watts was really, I'm like, oh, he's really into Buddhism and he is into Zen Buddhism, but his stuff really comes out of Hinduism. So maybe it's that same thing. Like Hess sees Buddhism. I don't know. Is Buddhism too much work? In the book, the character of Gautama, is there some, what are the kind of path that, how does Siddhartha's path deviate from the other mystics he runs into?
He's skeptical about teaching. The book it's very ironic because from maybe chapter 1, he's already hinting that his father and the Brahmins can't teach him anything. He's already absorbed everything that they have to offer. In every single chapter, he's like, no, you can't teach me, I'm moving on. No, you can't teach me, I'm moving on. So it's just that fact that self-discovery, self-realization, which is also, I think, more of an Hindu idea as well, but that you have to go out and figure it out for yourself. So he already has that bias that he's not going to be able to learn he's not truly going to be able to learn enlightenment from the Buddha. The teachings are good. He likes the teachings. Sounds great. But he's not really going to understand or know or capture what the Buddha experienced unless he does it himself.
Is that something we've talked about also, is you're like, I think this book is like, it's kind of a young man's book. And if you come to it really old, I'm not sure it resonates the same way. Is that character, it sounds like it's kind of embodying like this brash, like, I'm young, you don't have anything to tell me, I got to figure this stuff out on my own.
Yeah, so I was very much in that camp. I think I really identified with the young Siddhartha, and I kind of agreed. Like every time that he experienced and had this new awakening, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. I like that. And so I was a bit of a experience junkie. I was someone that was doing backpacking. After I'd read Into the Wild, I'd read it maybe like a few weeks before my spring break, and I went hitchhiking over spring break in college. So, I was very much into exploring, doing things. That Mark Twain quote about in 20 years you're gonna regret. Anyways, the one about regrets.
You took it to heart. You're like, I
I love that quote. So I was all about living life to the fullest, and so I really resonated with Siddhartha's journey. I also was having a little bit of an existential, I guess, dread. I had fallen in love in Europe for the first time backpacking, and it didn't work out, and I was a bit heartbroken, and I was kind of realizing things. I was looking into teaching science. I was studying some physics, and just kind of all that coming together, asking bigger questions, kind of getting into some like elementary philosophy, and Siddhartha kind of came into that same group of ideas, and I think I still really relate with a lot of Hesse's and Siddhartha's ideas.
It's so you mentioned Into the Wild. That book isn't. That was the thing that was taught when I helped student teach a class in college. I think one of the 3 books we did. I think I did the Into the Wild section, and it's intoxicating because it's a real story. It's the main character, Christopher McCandless, kind of doesn't fit into society, and just like you said, he wants to go be on his own, and so he'll go join with other people. He'll show up in a small town and have a job for a while to make money and get what he needs, and then he'll leave again. He'll leave for months at a time away from other people, and eventually the true story of Christopher McCandless has a dark side, because eventually he winds up by himself in a place he can't get out of. He can't get out of, and he starves to death, or he poisons himself on poisonous food. He runs into problems because he's by himself. So it balances out it's fun to go out and be the rugged individualist, and it reminds you, being a rugged individualist is extremely dangerous. Did you ever go as far as Christopher McCandless and like really put yourself in situations that felt shaky, and did you ever scare yourself?
I mean, I definitely took risks that I wouldn't take again as someone that's older, but I wasn't as extreme as him.
Okay.
I mean, for me, it was more like I was up at a mountain and it started snowing in August, which I had no idea was possible. And so I was extremely unprepared. So I was just very uncomfortable for 36 hours.
Day and a half of discomfort. Okay.
Yeah. Or like the first time I went backpacking, same thing. I was in Yosemite. The elevation there is about 8,000 or 9,000 feet, the spot that I was backpacking around. And I was looking at lightweight backpacking things, which I didn't realize were all desert environments, and it was summer, so I figured I'd be fine. I got lucky. This is more hindsight, but I got lucky. It could have been very cold out there, and had it been very cold, I would have been miserable. So like that's a good example of something that could have gone bad. It didn't go that bad for me, but just little things like that.
What was the shift? So you're young, you kind of have this early existential crisis. You're like, what am I here for? What is the point of life? What is this existence? Existential dread, existential crisis. But now, years later, I mean, you're kind of like the Hindu homesteader where you have a family and you have responsibilities, and it's a different mindset. how does your mind, do you feel like these questions that bothered you years ago are settled now, or have you set them aside? How do you still feel about these existential questions about why are we here and what's going on?
Yeah, I almost never think about them. It's more of it's probably a combination of setting them aside because I don't think they're worth my time. I mean, it's always fun to think about dying, like not fun. It's always interesting,
Yes.
not fun. But I mean, like I just don't I don't have the time and energy to care about those questions, and so I guess I'm way more focused on middle life, being a dad, kind of family life, kind of figuring out what our family is going to do, and not so much. I mean, I don't know. I still think about stuff like that, but yeah, it's different. It's more now. It's just pure nostalgia. Like I remember what it was like. I relate with the young man Siddhartha. I definitely relate to the Christopher McCandlesses, but when I read them now, it's not like, yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's like, no, that's kind of dumb, but like I get it.
Oh, so not only you can reflect back on, wow, this really got me, and then decades later you're like, I have had that reaction where there's certain things you read and you go back and you're like, me at the time and other people in that age, I recognize how that's not a dumb question and that's an important experience to have. But now much later, you're like, I can't repeat that. Like, I already have the answer to that question, or that thing just doesn't bother me anymore. What does it feel like?
Yeah, it's kind of in between there, I guess. I guess it's more like, wow, Christopher McCandless is really extreme.
Yeah.
But I do still relate with a lot of those aspects of being dissatisfied with society. That's another one. Very strong connection between McCandless and Siddhartha. Is they're very unsatisfied with society and the people around them. And so I can relate with that. I'm very much, in society. I'm not planning on leaving anytime soon, but like I get it. Like I'm not I guess I'm way more acceptable of society now. And yeah, everyone can't just leave society. That's not going to work out well.
What is it? Is it the politics? Is it the values of the people around you? Is it just having all these people around all the time? What was the part of society for Christopher McCandless? It seemed like he needed solitude. In addition to having some countercultural thoughts, he actually, when he would go to small towns, they would describe the people who talked about him. He kind of kept to himself, but he was friendly and nice, and he got along with everyone. But he just needed solitude. For you, is it what bothers you? Is it the values, the society, the politics, the advertising? What's the thing that rankles you about normal life?
So originally it was the consumerism, the materialism, as in owning physical things. I've kind of come around on that as well. It was I had something more like spiritual connection with the outdoors and hiking. So like that's part of it too. Like I really connected with being on top of a mountain and kind of being the only one out there and just looking over a lake, or like all those outdoor experiences, I guess, whatever you want to call them. And so those things definitely made me more skeptical of society. Also, just not sharing the values of what you see on TV, of what your friends are doing. Maybe people around you that are making decisions that you don't quite get, and then just making very simplest conclusions about them. Yeah, I mean that's probably a lot of it too. Just being young and thinking that I know way more than I actually did.
Oh, so is that you're accepting? Is it, do you think it's like a growing sense of humility that like there are things you thought, like maybe you still don't feel like you totally fit in, but you have much more personal humility about like, well, maybe I don't know the right answer. This seems like the wrong answer, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, something like that too. I told a friend maybe within the last couple of years, and he was really surprised. I was like, I don't really value my values. It's like I have values. Everybody thinks their values are good. If there's a value that was better, you would just change it because you would realize that that's not the best value. So I mean, I get that my values are the ones I think are best, but I don't actually value my values that much. I hope they'll be better in 10 years. I hope they'll be even better in 20 years. And I'm a lot more forgiving and accepting of other people that have varying values. Whereas when I was younger, I would be kind of outraged if someone didn't share my values, which is just so ridiculous because we all have different experiences, we all have different upbringings, and to just assume that I just learned this thing yesterday in a book and now everybody I come in contact with needs to care about this and go read this book. And when they don't, you get a little frustrated, and so you blame society. And so now I just realize, like, no one's going to read a book I want them to read. The same reason, if they told me to read a book, I probably wouldn't read it either because I don't want to read that book. I want to read the books that I want to read or watch the things that I want to watch. So yeah, just coming to terms with the fact that other people aren't going to care about the same things as you, and that's completely fine.
Is there a way in which Siddhartha over the years are there parts of it that you highlight as kind of like, well, that appealed to me as a youth? Because the end of the book, it does peter out, kind of like all the stories of the Buddha himself. He gets older and then he dies. And the people get old and they die at the end of this book. Is there anything in here that kind of speaks to you now as an older reader of the book versus a younger reader?
So my last 2 to 3 readings, yeah, I really relate more, or not relate more, but I love Vasudeva. He is the ferryman, the older ferryman. And so I'm starting to realize that like he is the really admirable character. Whereas the main character, Siddhartha, kind of has his own flaws. And I'm starting to see that more and more as I become older. Kind of the flaws in Siddhartha. And also, Vasudeva is a character that is illiterate. I think it's safe to say he wasn't the Brahmin class. Whereas like Siddhartha is the Brahmin class. They say in the first few paragraphs, everybody loves Siddhartha. He's good looking. He's handsome. He's the best student. So he goes on. I mean, Siddhartha has a pretty good life, a pretty easy life. He's extremely smart. The main thing he has against him is he's depressed. So yeah, so he's got all the tools and he's depressed. I mean, there is a lot of arrogance with him. He's constantly showing that he's superior to characters. He does it to his dad. He does it to the Samana. He does it to the Buddha. So yeah, I mean, there's just those things I overlooked when I was younger because I was probably a little bit more like that as well, just being arrogant. And now I'm starting to see that like Vasudeva's a good listener. He's the one that he actually speaks out to Siddhartha he gives him unsolicited advice. Whereas like Siddhartha has his friend come back to him at the end of the book, just begging him, annoying him to like help him in any way. And Siddhartha's just like, gives him these analogies that Siddhartha knows he's not going to be able to teach him anything. So
he's already decided, I can't teach you. Whatever you need to learn about this, I can't teach you. So he's just kind of putting him off.
Kind of. And I mean, I don't think he's intentionally being rude, but like Vasudeva, when Vasudeva sees Siddhartha struggling for an extended amount of time, he finally steps up and is like, hey, dude, get your shit together. Listen to the river. The river will tell you. And Siddhartha doesn't do that for Govinda. He doesn't say, hey, man, go. I mean, and maybe he's right. Maybe he can't. But there is like a difference there where like now I see as Vasudeva, the uneducated person, the one that really is the one that's really living by the practical wisdom, I guess.
Is there that ferryman character reminds me, I just got obsessed in the last year. I read The Confession by Leo Tolstoy, where Leo Tolstoy experiences, he is in the same situation as Siddhartha, where he's wildly successful. His family's very happy. Everyone wants him to speak. Everyone wants him to write. Everybody wants to hear what he has to say. And he winds up for a number of years having absolutely horrendous suicidal depression. And he talks about, there's this very famous line where he talks about making sure there's no guns in the house ever. Oh, he doesn't go hunting with his friends, and he makes sure there's no rope in the house because he knows if he goes hunting, he knows he wants to kill himself. So he holds it off. And he tries to figure out what is going on. Everything's great with me. Why do I feel so bad? And ultimately, kind of like this ferryman character, he winds up looking at, there's death all around. And the people who are the most miserable are these impoverished peasants around me. And yet they are happy and content with their lot. And they deal with death very well. So terrible things happen and they don't run from death. They take care of dead bodies. Whereas he's like, all these intellectual elites and everything were very uncomfortable with life and death, especially death. So he starts looking, what can I learn from these peasants? And he kind of figures out there's this basic sense, there's some kind of love that we have, a compassion, helping people, which maybe the ferryman's figured out. You don't have to go to school for this. Tolstoy says all the intellectual elites they're all off on the wrong track. They're vain, self-centered. They don't have any wisdom to impart at all. And he thinks these peasants are the ones that have the wisdom. And not by telling them things, but by watching what they do. So like you're talking about, like, watching what the ferryman does. How does he give advice? What kind of advice does he give? How does he live his life?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it sounds good.
I do need to at the end, does it feel like the book comes to an absolute conclusion? So Siddhartha is going on these journeys on his own, saying, I can't teach anything, you can't teach anything to me, but I want to have these experiences and try to figure this stuff out. And then the book eventually does end, and the ferryman's at the end of the book, right?
Yeah. You want me spoilers, I guess, or
you can right. So this is the case. So spoilers. If somebody's like, I want to read it for the first time, the book has been around a long time. So if you want to keep it fresh, then you can ignore it.
Yeah, you've had 101 years to read the book. I think we can spoil it at this point. Yeah, I mean, I think the ending. I didn't really like the ending for years, I guess, but it is very ironic. It's almost because Siddhartha does teach his friend. He does pass the wisdom to him. He does pass enlightenment to him, which is the book has been telling you since chapter 1 that is not possible. So it's extremely ironic. It contradicts itself. And then the book also, even personally, the fact that I've gained so much from the book, just by the experience of reading it, is also a bit ironic itself. So I'm not sure how intentional that's supposed to be. And I don't really have a great answer. I think it's if you look at it like a fairy tale, it's very much a fairy tale ending. And I think the original title is something like an Indian fable or an Indian tale. So maybe it is supposed to be a cliche fairy tale type ending.
Another thing in some of the writing we've done back and forth, you talked about, I don't think like Tolstoy, maybe when Tolstoy got really old, in letters I've seen in his last few years of being alive, people are still coming to him for advice, and he's still he's trying to be more patient with these people. Like, you notice, I got really irritated with these people. Everybody showed up and they wanted to talk to me about this and talk to me about that. And the next day he's writing in his diary, I'm still impatient. I'm still trying to deal with this stuff. So he's still on a journey of trying to become a better person. I have the feeling when Hesse wrote this that Hesse was not resolved about what the answer to life is. For sure, we know what the meaning of life is. It's captured in this book. So maybe whatever uncertainty there is in the book is a result because the person writing it also not totally certain. Maybe there's not a clear lesson in the book.
Yeah, there's this phrase called the small gap. Siddhartha tells the Buddha in the story, there's this small gap. And I think you can see Hesse's small gap in the story as well. Yes, because I mean exactly what you're saying. Hesse, like Tolstoy, could not follow their own, I guess ethics and morality. Where I mean Tolstoy more so, I guess. But I mean Hesse was not mentally healthy. He was a very troubled. He did psychotherapy. He worked with a student that was right under Jung, and so I mean, yeah, being able to write that book didn't help him live the second half of his life by any means. He was a very disagreeable person, similar to Tolstoy. He spent a lot of time alone there's a fun quote of his, something along the lines of, someone asked him why he writes, and he's like, well, I write because I can't paint the whole day. Like I simply can't paint all day long, so I'll do some writing in between. But yeah, I mean, he's living up in the Alps, and he kind of abandons his kids. Just not a very easy person to be around.
Did you ever in your life want to be, so that thing you noted about not so great, writing things about great virtues and ideals and the meaning of life, etc., as an artist, or painting it or making the music, and then those people not having easy lives, not making good choices that we see regular people make all the time. Did you ever want to be, at any point, read these books by these greats and be like, I want to be one of these greats?
I don't know. I think that's also maybe a young man's thing. You think you're going to be famous. You think you're going to be a professional athlete in 5 different sports and all these weird things when you're younger. I guess I've always had this idea that I had something worth sharing, that I've maybe come to terms with that. But so I don't know exactly how to answer that. I mean, I guess a little bit, but not to the extent that you're saying. I don't think I ever wanted to be Leo Tolstoy
or Herman Hesse.
Yeah.
Are there ways? So, if this is inside baseball and you don't talk about this stuff, you don't have to. But I'm curious about your kids. My own internal journeys have kind of led me to some of the conclusions you're talking about, where I'm like, well, what's so great about my values? I mean, it's true, there are some values, like you need to be nice. I try to get my kid to be nice to people, and I try to get my kid, if you promise to do something, you should do it. So there's some basic values, but really big, like trying to shape a kid. When you went into parenthood, did you try to shape and teach the way, maybe people around Siddhartha did? Or you like, no, the kids need to do it on their own. I can't teach them to do this.
So a little more background. So I taught in the U.S. for 4 years as a classroom teacher. So I have a master's in education, and I taught English as a language art. And so I'm familiar with teaching, and I know the benefits of education, and like I know the things that really make or break a child's future at the younger ages as well. So I guess I started teaching my daughter the ABCs when she was once she started talking practically. Okay. We started doing phonics when she was like 2. She's only 5 now, so she just started kindergarten last week, actually.
So you're definitely aiming on the literacy, yes?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I mean, like I know, like and as I said, I didn't really start reading till after I graduated college. I was in my mid to late 20s, and so for me, I was terrible at reading growing up. I didn't learn phonics. I was one of those kids that I would count the paragraphs and try and predict what paragraph was mine when we were reading out loud in class. So and I had so much anxiety about it. And so I really, it's embarrassing that I was able to graduate college considering what my reading and writing skills were at the time.
And you became an English teacher.
Yeah, so I had to go back. So my first degree was in exercise and sports science.
Okay.
You felt like you had to go I got a degree in push-ups.
Okay. But then you decided to get an English degree. So there's literacy, but do you feel like values or the meaning of life, whether it's religion, spirituality, mysticism, or moral value, do you feel like you're a hard push on or a light touch when it comes to your kids?
Yeah, I don't really think about it that much. So here's an example. Yeah. We have a pass to our local museum, and our pass it allows a guest. A guest can take my daughter to the museum under our membership. It's not 100% clear, but so we had someone that was watching our child for us, and we were going away for a night, yeah. And so I just said, yeah, the pass will get you in. If it doesn't, then we'll just pay you back.
Right.
And the woman looks enough like my wife where she went in and she just pretended to be my wife. And so
she just said, right, when they asked her, she just gave the name and like,
yeah. And so my daughter didn't say anything in front of the workers. She said something after they already got through. And so our friend was saying, yeah, that's really cool. You taught your daughter to like be quiet and not just blurb it. And I was like, no, that's not cool. For one, that's not what I taught my daughter. I was like, I would have rather paid the full membership, or whatever, the full fee, right, than to teach. Because what we really taught her is it's okay to lie. So
right, you're like, your daughter really knows when to keep the con quiet and when to talk about it after. She's really good at managing that.
I was like, she doesn't know that. We didn't teach her that. She's probably just too shy to speak in front of that person. But yeah, so like I would much rather pay $20 than teach by showing that it's okay to lie or to be dishonest.
So that teach by showing, I don't know if you see this. You feel like, in fact, I just saw this modeled for me a couple days ago. The tell not show, where it's like the parent is constantly telling the kid what they're supposed to do. And my attitude, yes, is kind of the same way. If you want a kid to do something, then you model it, and then they either take it on or they don't. But telling somebody to do something but not showing it all the time, I mean, people tell us crap all the time. Just like you said, like you're talking about books. People are telling us to read books all the time. Just because you tell me to read the book doesn't mean I need to or want to or anything.
Yeah, no, I mean, 100%. I think teachers see this a little bit more. Yeah, but I mean, you are teaching your kids every single second of the day, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah. So you're not trying to get people to read Siddhartha. Great if they do. Is there anything, originally we were talking about with this book, because I was thinking about this for another podcast. Oh man, we need to come up with some actionable stuff out of here. And so I'm wondering, maybe just, you did have a few things. If anything jumps to mind, are there particular things you think things they can learn from this book, or an idea, not just the overall book and its plot, but a particular idea in here that really grabbed you and has never let go? Something that's kind of either in there, either a practice or something, some mindset or some idea in there that really grabbed you and still grabs you.
I would say there's a handful. I think kind of the teaching what we just discussed. I think there is wisdom in the idea that you can't teach or you can't express wisdom. Like you can't transfer like I can't transfer wisdom to my daughter no matter how much I want to. I think that's right. But the flip side is you can teach a lot of things that can maybe help her to acquire wisdom. So that's kind of, I guess, I think the book practically shows that without explicitly saying it. I think Siddhartha's kind of, he's maybe wrong. He's wrong about that you can't, or that teaching is a waste of time, or that you can't learn anything. I think he proves that at the end when he's able to somehow transfer some wisdom over to his friend. So I would say that comes away. It kind of has to. I mean, if you're reading something and you're taking something away, it's
right.
So that's that goes back to the ironic part. I would say another one that makes the book hold up is scientifically and psychologically. There's nothing really going on in the book that we can write out, debunk scientifically. So that makes it philosophically seem a little more sound.
There's no, like for instance, in many religious texts, if you're not looking at them metaphorically, there are wild supernatural claims or wild supernatural claims that crazy things happened or that crazy things caused it, and the book is not really jammed with that.
Yes, in Siddhartha, I think it's probably safe to assume that the character Siddhartha should believe in reincarnation, but the book doesn't. I don't even think it uses the word once. It talks about cycles, but it doesn't. That's like a very westernized take on it. Because I think a lot of Westerners would, especially probably in the 1920s, would have a really hard time accepting that idea. Whereas like in the East, it's not even something you would think about.
Right. That if the practical aspect of like, am I, Brendan, or you, James, supposed to think about what we're going to do, and then based on what we do, that's how we're going to be reincarnated after we die. Right. A lot of Westerners are like, that doesn't really fit. Heaven and hell, sure, they got that down, but this idea that we're going to come back and back, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that, I mean, yeah. So there's no things like that where you could just say, you could make a scientific claim for reincarnation as well, but just like the oneness, the interconnectedness of the universe, I think science is probably saying more and more that's right. I mean, we're all made out of the same elements, and then those things are broken down and they're made out of the same pieces. And the further they look, the more it's kind of does appear to be a oneness, whether, I mean, maybe not a direct, 100% correlation between philosophy and science, but I mean, it definitely fits. And same thing with like the psychological stuff that's going on with Siddhartha. I mean, you could easily kind of, one of the ones I like is hedonic treadmill. This idea that we have like a base state, and that we're always going back to that base state. And even if something really good happens to us, eventually we're back at the base state. Something really bad happens to us, we go back to the base state. And I think you can see that in Siddhartha too. Siddhartha has some really high points, goes back to the base state. Has some really bad points, goes back to the base state. So I think like psychologically and scientifically, the book kind of supports the world that we're in right now.
Yeah, I do like, I mean, that has been my experience. I don't know if it's true or not. So there are some human beings that that doesn't seem to be as much for them. They really do think that they are achieving and growing and succeeding, and that there's no kind of settling. So if you stop growing, they perceive life as going up a ladder or down a ladder. So if you go down the ladder, you can go back up. They don't really perceive I think maybe it's more like a rubber band. Like you can get really, really happy over here, really, really sad over here. But the pressure your body and psychology will exert is to try to pull you back to wherever your chemicals, the brain, wherever your brain's used to being, that's kind of where it wants to go. Let's just bring it back to where it was. So you can never get so happy, you'll never be that sad again. You never get so sad, you'll never be that happy again.
And then this is another one. This is maybe the interpretation I like more now.
Okay.
is more of a evolutionary psychology approach, whereas the reason why Siddhartha can really figure it out as an old man is because he no longer has a biological need to do anything. So, I mean, like when we're young, if you want to think of it, we need to be the best so we can, find the best find the best partner to create our offspring, even though we might, like Siddhartha's not really trying to reproduce, but he still has that urge to be the best, to seek, to find something. And I think as a young man, like I definitely related with that. And then with time, eventually those urges kind of decrease. And then eventually, now this is my interpretation, once you become an old man, now you don't have that evolutionary desire and urges to keep seeking, to keep finding. And now you can kind of just sit back, raise your grandchildren, accept the world as it is. And so I think that's also, I think enlightenment is probably more like just not having the biological urges to want to be the best and to want to do these other things, and to just being like, you know what, I'm kind of cool with where life is now. So I think that's probably, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's fascinating because, at the beginning you're like, this feels more Hindu than Buddhist. And it absolutely does. The thing I've always liked about Hinduism is it sort of accepts these are the cycle. It's not just these mega cycles of like the creation is created and then the God destroys it and it's created again. But in the individual life, they have this homesteader time when, exactly as you're saying, you're looking for a mate, you're having kids, you're building resources so you can raise your kids. But then in the Hindu, these 4 life cycles, the one at the end is, well, you're old, so you kind of you don't throw away your family, but you don't have any responsibility to your family anymore. So now you can finally get old and wander as a wandering monk or a wandering beggar. Now this is a period you can just wander, think about the universe. So it does, it kind of lends being more accepting of that everybody has all these urges and this power for this period of your life, then eventually move on to another stage and another stage. Yeah.
So I think the practical wisdom, if someone wants the practical wisdom, it's just to get old. And then, just get old.
Yeah, so stay alive. So yes.
Stay alive and get old.
Right, stay alive and get old. And the wisdom and the insight will come.
Yeah. Yeah, eventually you'll accept whatever oneness, you find in the world, and you'll finally be happy.
I do feel less when you're younger. If you yearn for this kind of wisdom that comes later, or you yearn for enlightenment, there's way more battle and grinding against the people around you. Like you described, like kind of not fitting into society, being angry or judgmental about these people around you that don't share your values. And the older you get, you're like, well, my values are about the same, but I don't hold on to them so tightly, and I'm not so bothered that all these other people don't live by these values. But yeah, you just get old. Oh, your energy goes down. You just don't care as much about this stuff anymore. Like, oh, okay, the goal is just to get old.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's probably it. So that's my practical advice from the book. Get old.
That is super. Other than people who unfortunately will, like James Dean, people who would die in like car crashes at a young age. That's awesome. So if you can just stay old, you also can be enlightened.
Yeah, you'll get there eventually. You just have to get through young adulthood, middle ages. It's not a guarantee, I guess, but it's the chances will significantly increase.